Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to analyze an article from The Hindu, which is about China's decision to block US and India's proposal to designate Abdul Rahman Makki as a terrorist. Abdul Rahman Makki, he is the Deputy Chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba students. So in this video, I'm going to first take you through the main points of the article. Then after that, I'm going to talk about, terrorism as a concept, what terrorism is, what are its main features, what are the various, channels of funding for terrorists, and what are the root causes of terrorism. And we're going to particularly look at terrorism in India's context. That is how India is impacted by terrorism over the years and what India has been doing to prevent it, right? So let's get started. So students, according to this article, which is titled Designation Failure on China's Decision to Block Terror Tag for Lashkar Leader. China's decision on June 16 to block the UN Security Council designation of Lashkar-e-Taiba Deputy Chief Abdul Rahman Makki as a terrorist. So according to this article, China has blocked the UNSC designation of Lashkar-e-Taiba Deputy Chief Abdul Rahman Makki as a terrorist. And it's not just this, but Beijing, China had repeatedly blocked the designation of Jaish-e-Mohammed Chief Masood Azhar until 2019 and other terrorist designations prior to that, students. So basically, this is not the first time that China has blocked the designation of an international terrorist, right? So basically, students, it's like if a particular person or a group is labeled as a terrorist or a terrorist group, due lawful actions can be taken against them, right? However, in the absence of that designation, taking some concrete steps against them becomes difficult. So China has been regularly blocking the designation of terrorist students. In the past, it has blocked the designation of Jaish-e-Mohammed Chief Masood Azhar until 2019. So students, you should know the names of these terrorist groups. For example, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba was Hafiz Saeed. And then of course, Jaish-e-Mohammed, its chief Masood Azhar, right? So China has blocked their designations in the past, and now the deputy chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Abdul Rahman Makki, his designation as a terrorist has been blocked by China. And Lashkar-e-Taiba and JUD students, that's the new name of Lashkar-e-Taiba, has been prosecuted in India, the United States, and even Pakistan for the 26/11 Mumbai attacks. So these groups have faced prosecution in India and US and even Pakistan after the Mumbai attack, students. And Makki was himself tried and sentenced by Pakistani special court to 9 years imprisonment. So in spite of such, I would say, strong evidences against these terrorist groups and terrorists, China has blocked their designation as terrorist on the international forums. Now, India wanted, Makki to be designated as terrorist because he has been found to be involved in the various attacks that have taken place in India. For example, the Red Fort attack in 2000. And more recently, attacks on our security forces in Jammu and Kashmir, students. And the Pulwama attack, basically. And Makki is also on India's UAPA. This is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, students. I will talk about it later. So Makki is also on India's list of designated terrorists and also on the US specially designated global terrorist. And in fact, there is a $2 million reward for information that would convict him. Now, given this, India and US had forwarded the proposal to put him on the United Nations Security Council's 1267 list of terrorists. So basically, there is a list of terrorists. These are those people who are recognized by United Nations Security Council or identified by them as terrorists, right? So they wanted to get Makki included in this list because he's been found to link to Al-Qaeda and ISIL as well. And there's overwhelming evidence against him. So, however, China has blocked his designation as a terrorist, and New Delhi as well as US have called this very regrettable and extremely unfortunate. Now, students, why China chose to act this way? So this, China's actions may be motivated by growing negativity or acrimony, which is bitterness with US and India students, right? That could be one reason, but it is clearly a part of a pattern of protecting Pakistanis internationally, students. So China has been protecting Pakistan and Pakistan-based terrorist groups, groups that are provided shelter by Pakistan, or that the groups that originated in Pakistan. So China has clearly been protecting them from past many years. And it is also notable that as a result of China's objection or otherwise, none of the terror designation under UNSC 1267 thus far against Lashkar-e-Taiba commander Rahman Lakwi in 2008, Hafiz Saeed in 2009, Masood Azhar in 2019 actually contains charges against them for any attacks carried out in India. So these people or these terrorist groups have openly taken responsibility for various terrorist attacks in certain cases also. Yet students, because of China's objection, these people and these terrorist groups do not face any charges. And it is necessary for the government, now this is the final view that is taken by the author, that India should not be discouraged by China's objections. In fact, it is necessary for the government to continue to gather evidence and systematically build its case on cross-border terrorism on international stage that cannot be derailed by political or geopolitical considerations, right? So India should continue to make its case stronger on the basis of stronger evidence, so that these political and geopolitical considerations do not derail India's fight against terrorism. Now, students, let's understand how terrorism is defined. What is the concept called terrorism? So, students, as per the definition of United Nations, any criminal act intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, or a particular person or persons in any circumstances unjustifiable, whatever the considerations of political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any nature that may be invoked to justify them, right? If you look at the FBI's definition, it is an unlawful use of force, students. So you should know these important key, terms that are used to define terrorism, so that if there is any topic on terrorism by PIN, BAT, or GD, you should use these terms. So terrorism is the unlawful use of force, students, or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, civilian population, or any segment for furtherance of political or social objectives. Now, what do we understand by this definition, students? Number one, it is unlawful use of force. Please pay attention. Number one, it is unlawful use of force. Number two, students, it is in furtherance of political or social objectives, right? So these are not just any random unlawful or violent attack or use of force. It is a very systematic use of force for furtherance of the political or social objectives of any group, students, right? Next, students, let's understand what are the causes of terrorism, or what is at the root of terrorism. So number one, students, socioeconomic objectives, right? So socioeconomic explanations of terrorism suggest that various forms of deprivation drive people to terrorism. So when there is deprivation of any kind among a certain group, for example, deprivation means lack of something. For example, lack of wealth, lack of opportunities, lack of employment, right? So these people are usually driven to terrorism. They start using force when they have a sense that they are not being heard by the authorities, or the government is not doing much for them. They are driven to terrorism. They take to arms and they use violence to further their objectives. So it could be poverty, lack of education, lack of political freedom. These are few examples. Next, students, religious reasons. So it is widely believed that religion themselves do not cause terrorism, right? So religion itself doesn't cause terrorism, but it is the misinterpretation of religion, or for that matter, willful misinterpretation of religion to further one's political goals or social or political objectives, that terrorism can be based on religion also, students, right? So students, we have organizations such as Al-Qaeda, Om Shinkrio, which is a Japanese cult group, then Christian identity group, students. So they have been carrying out a lot of terrorist activities. And they find legitimacy based on certain things quoted in their religious text, right, which they misinterpret. So, for example, religious ideas such as martyrdom were seen as particularly dangerous students. So, martyrdom has a very different meaning as per religion. Martyrdom can never be done for violent activities, students, right? However, there are groups who legitimize their activities, violent activities, citing religion. Next, students, political reasons. So political reasons could be, it is like an organized political violence by a non-state army or group, students. So political, terrorism is usually carried out by separatist group, students. There are certain groups like ethnic groups that are probably not satisfied being part of a certain country, a certain region, and they want to assert independence. They have separatist demands, right? They want the government to carve out a separate state or a separate country, and it's then that they carry out various violent activities, which is also a form of terrorism. For example, you see their regular terrorist activities in the northeast part of the country, certain other parts of the country, students, where there are demands for separate country or separate state, right? In the past, there were Tamilian separatist groups in Sri Lanka. So we've seen such terrorist activities as well. Strategic activities, students. Strategic activities is when people don't have any separatist demands, but terrorist activity is targeted at a larger political or social objective. It could be any objective, right? So it is not a random activity. Like, for example, if you look at the Hamas group, right, the Palestinian Hamas group. So it uses terrorist tactics to leverage violence in order to gain specific concessions related to their goals vis-a-vis Israel and Fatah, right? So students, terrorism is typically described as a strategy of the weak seeking to gain advantage against stronger armies or political powers. So when we look at terrorism through the strategic lens, it is basically a strategy employed by the weak, right, who want to gain advantage against stronger armies or political powers. Now, students, if we look at the financial structure of terrorism, that what are the sources of finances for terrorism? So number one, students, it's of course the formal channels like the banks. So even though there have been a lot of attempts by the various governments to have strong regulatory and banking systems in place such that any kind of fraudulent or money laundering activities, terrorism financing activities can be detected, identified, and blocked, right? However, any system is never fail-proof, right? There are certain gaps and loopholes which are capitalized upon by the terrorist, students. And sometimes banks are in the know also. They're cognizant of it, but they continue that because they choose to gain profit. They profiteer from such activities, right? Then students, a lot of business and criminal activities. There are businesses, illegal businesses, criminal activities. They channelize their, wealth or income to, or their contribution to terrorist groups because they seek their support to carry out their unlawful and illegal activities. So it's like a win-win situation for them. Then students, business controlled by terrorists. There are cases where terrorists themselves control business. So revenues from them also are directed towards terrorist activities. Then charitable front organization, students, a lot of charitable organizations, they raise funds in the name of religion and they direct the proceeds to terrorist activities. Then individual terrorist operative students, that is another way of funding. State-sponsored terrorism students. So that is very common. For example, state-sponsored terrorism is when the state, the recognized legitimate government of a country, supports terrorism. We've seen that happening in Pakistan in the past. Iraq is another country that is known to openly fund terrorism, right? So these are various sources from where terrorists get their funds. Now, students, what are the features of terrorism? So number one, terrorism does not attempt to challenge the government forces directly, right? That is number one. But act to change perceptions as to effectiveness or legitimacy of the government itself. That is one. So it might not be directly challenging the government, but changing the perceptions about the effectiveness of the government. That this government, so they would carry out various, violent activities, criminal activities, unlawful activities, and they would make people believe, look, this government is not effective enough to provide you with safe and secure living existence, right? So they try to change the perception towards government. Then students, they commit to acts of violence. This is the strategy or technique employed by terrorism. They commit acts of violence, students, to draw attention to some matter, to their demands, right? And they want to gain publicity for their acts, students. That is, sometimes you must have seen that there's a terrorist attack and there are groups who, claim that the activity has been conducted or organized by them. So they take responsibility for that. Why? Because they want to draw public attention. The effectiveness of the terrorist activities lies not just in the act, but also public's and government's reaction to it, because they get publicity through that, right? And students, they also want to inculcate fear in the minds of the viewer. So it is to strike fear in their hearts and minds. They do not attempt to control any terrain as it ties them to identifiable locations. So they usually carry out guerrilla war, students. They don't, try to control any terrain very often, as long as they've not become dominant enough to do that, right? Because then they would be identified with a certain tied to a certain location and can easily be tracked and prevented from carrying out the activities. Now, students, if you look at the recent events, so internationally, terrorism today is marked by a large number of transnational terrorist groups, students. So one, main observation here is that terrorism no more is localized. That there was a time, few decades back, that terrorism was very localized activity. It was limited to certain parts of the world, very small parts of the world, right? Pakistan was one such hotspot. Then Middle East, some portion, there was some, hotspot. But now if you see it spread throughout the world, almost, no continent is free from terrorism. So in the years following the World Trade Center attack on 9th September 2001, students, the 9/11 attacks as they're popularly called, Al-Qaeda was at the forefront of debates on terrorism. So Al-Qaeda is one, and the whole thing moved to center stage after the 9/11 attacks. Then students, Taliban in Afghanistan, right? It was closely allied with Al-Qaeda, and that's also a key actor here. Then students, very important, rise of Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, students, Iraq and Syria, right? So ISIL, this group has emerged as one of the most powerful group in the recent past. And it's then, students, we have heightened activities. By the way, ISIL, that's a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. Then students, the activities of Boko Haram in Nigeria. So this is a terrorist group in Africa, Boko Haram, students. Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, and Charlie Hebdo in Paris, students. You must have heard of Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, related to that caricature and cartoon. So basically, they are Islamic fundamentalists. And then, students, we had these hostage crises in Sydney, Australia, and same group was linked to that also. So these groups have raised the specter of terrorism and kindled, debates on terrorism, motivated by religion, the issue of freedom of expression, and global efforts in combating terrorism. So these are some of the main terrorist groups, the recent past. Now, students, if you look at India and the issue of international terrorism in the recent times. So students, now the issue of terrorism has once again become India's primary concern since the Al-Qaeda chief, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in a video released in September 2014, announced the launch of Qadat al-Jihad in the Indian subcontinent to carry out jihadist activities in India and Myanmar, right? So he had openly released a video, publicly released a video saying that it would carry out systematic jihadi efforts in India. And so India's whole effort of combating terrorism got renewed, right? ISIS threatened India's interest in region that involves energy security. So students, when ISIS, when it strengthens, or it gains prominence, or it spreads, its activities increase, that impacts India's not just directly in terms of the activities that they carry out, but also it threatens India's energy security, because India is reliant on certain countries of the Middle East, particularly for their fuel and energy needs. So we import fuel, energy from those countries. And these terrorist groups are very dominant and active in those regions. Those regions, they're the hotspot of terrorism. So India, it directly impacts India's energy security, right? Then students, we have a lot of, citizens, India's citizens working abroad. For example, we have Indian nurses working in Iraq, in the Middle East, right? A lot of construction workers working there. So a few years back, the Indian nurses were, abducted in Iraq. So that threatens the security and safety of our nationals also who go abroad to work in these regions. And finally, students, Indian involvement in Afghanistan in the reconstruction efforts has made the Indian civilian presence in the country a prominent target for groups such as Taliban and the Haqqani network, students, right? So India, we all know, had been engaging with Afghanistan, in form of various reconstruction activities. In order to develop Afghanistan, India had made a lot of investment in Afghanistan, and that has further made India a target for groups such as Taliban and the Haqqani network, which is very active in Afghanistan, right? Now, if we look at terrorism in India, so students, India faces terrorism from secessionists in Kashmir, the separatist group in Kashmir, students. So we all know the terrorist activities are very, common in Kashmir. That is one hotspot of terrorism in India. Then the Northeast, again, the separatist groups. And to some extent in Punjab also, right? From left-wing extremist group in Central, East Central, and South Central India. And there are certain leftist group also. We all, there are groups that carry out a lot of unlawful activities in the central and southern part of the country. So they are leftist, basically, communist, and they are extremist groups who have been carrying out the terrorist activities. Then India is one of the countries most affected by terrorism in the world. According to the Institute for Economic and Peace, India was the 7th most affected country in 2018, students. So we are one of the most affected countries by terrorism, and we were 7th on the list, students, right? And From 2001 till 2018, more than 8,000 people died in terrorist attack in India. You should have these figures, students. Jammu and Kashmir is the region most affected by terrorist activities in the country. And the Global Terrorism Index 2019 also places India on the 7th rank in terms of most affected countries by terrorism. And it was after the 26/11 attacks. 26/11 attacks, students, the terrorist attacks in Mumbai Taj Hotel, right? So after the 26/11 attacks on Mumbai by terrorist groups, government formed the National Investigation Agency, NIA. So National Investigation Agency is the primary agency or organization formed by the government that works towards preventing terrorism in the country, right? Then students, the current law in India enacted to tackle terrorism of all kinds is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Act, students. UAPA, it is called. Please keep this in mind. UAPA, students. This is Unlawful Activities Amendment Act. So this is the principal act or the law, the primary act or law that has been enacted to tackle terrorism in India. And India is also trying to push a global intergovernmental convention called the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism to counter terrorism since the late 90s, students. So India has been at the forefront, obviously, because India is severely impacted by terrorism. So India is one of the countries that is very vocal about terrorism on all the international forums. And it has been trying to push a global intergovernmental convention called CCIT, Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, to combat or counter terrorism. India is also a member of FATF, students, Financial Action Task Force, FATF. I spoke about it in the current affairs video also, that it has, FATF has decided to continue Pakistan on the gray list, that it has not been able to sufficiently, meet its commitments of preventing terrorism on its soil. So this is an international organization, right? And India is also a member of this, students. It is an organization that works towards establishing global standards for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. Because you see, money laundering and terrorist financing, these are two major, two factors. If prevented or if we attack at the root of these, terrorism would be certainly weakened, students, because they thrive on it. Terrorists needs resources to thrive and succeed, right? They get their money from money laundering activities and terrorist financing activities. If we were to strike at the root of these, if we somehow as a world can cut off them, we can certainly weaken terrorism and terrorists. And India also has a network of intelligence agencies such as Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, the Intelligence Bureau, IB, which are involved in fighting terrorism emanating both inside and outside the country, students. Of course, we have a network of intelligence activities, right? So intelligence is, about focused on preventing, that we can gather intelligence, right? Or information about the various secret activities of the terrorists so that we can prevent their activities. So two most important organizations for this, RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, and the Intelligence Bureau, IB, students. So very quickly, once again, which are the various agencies and laws? We have National Investigation Agency, NIA, to combat terrorism. We have got Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Act, right? We are trying to push CCIT, Comprehensive Convention on National Terrorism, FATF, Financial Action Task Force, and also we have network of intelligence agencies, RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, and the Intelligence Bureau, students, to fight terrorism. Then, students, we have NAT Grid, National Intelligence Grid. This is recently made, and that is an integrated intelligence framework connecting the databases of security agencies of the Indian government, students. So basically, we have different bodies and agencies that working to combat terrorism, right? So NAT Grid, it is like one platform that brings all these agencies together on the same forum so that they can exchange the information and act in a coordinated manner to prevent terrorism and to weaken terrorism. So NAT grid students, National Intelligence Grid, again, a very important forum, students. And finally, we have the National Security Guard, NSG. It is a paramilitary force, students, that is primarily responsible for counter-terrorism and anti-hijacking operations. So National Security Guard, that's a paramilitary force, students, that works to fight or counter terrorism. So students, this is the link for this article. I would share this in the description box also. So that's all for this video. I will see you very soon with another editorial analysis video. Thank you so much.